And so what I'm going to do is talk about the behaviors of a group of snakes we call the pit vipers. And you're probably familiar with the pit vipers. They are a recently evolved and really successful group of snakes. There's hundreds of species, and we've got a bunch of them in the southeastern United States. And this photograph that I'm starting with just shows that big, impressive eastern diamondback rattlesnake, which a lot of people think is, oh, that's a archetypal kind of pit viper. They're named after the pit vipers, the heat-seeking pits in their face, so they can sense infrared radiation, but they've got a host of really cool adaptations, both in terms of their morphology, things like their venom delivery system, and things like those heat-sensing pits, but they've also got fascinating behaviors, and I'll focus on that. And so you're probably familiar with eastern diamondbacks, and it's, of course, not the only big rattlesnake we've got in the Southeast. You guys are probably equally familiar with the canebrake rattlesnake, sometimes called timber rattlesnakes. I've got a little inset of Florida there. They unfortunately don't quite reach us into land, which is just south of that green. But they're another kind of typical widespread pit viper, and pit vipers are found from Argentina. 3 species make it into Canada and everywhere in between. In the New World, these are incredibly successful animals. And a lot of that has to do with their behaviors. So you've got the 2 big rattlesnakes, but then you've also got their closest relatives, which are in the same genus, the southern copperhead. You can see this guy here. That's actually taken in South Carolina, right? I think by Hardy, right as we crossed the border. I found him in a classic foraging posture up against a fallen log where it can ambush mice. So you've got copperheads. You've also got their more aquatic relative, the water moccasin, or folks like to call them cottonmouths. Either's fine. And so we've got a real diversity of these snakes, and they do a variety of different things. But interestingly, many of their behaviors are working in pretty much the same fashion. And so I'm actually going to spend most of my time talking about pygmy rattlesnakes because I've spent so much time working with them. And it's also kind of maybe fun for you because they're not quite as abundant in the Carolinas as they are down here in Florida. And they're a beautiful little snake, and you'll get to know more about them and their behaviors as I talk. And so I do all my research with a bunch of collaborators, guys like Peter May on the bottom left, Craig Lind on the right, Sarah Smiley, who's holding a rodent, which we think of as snake food, and a huge numbers of Stetson students. I've had loads of Stetson students play really important roles in our research. And some of you guys have been out to Lake Woodruff National Wildlife Refuge. It's a beautiful place. Over 20 species of snakes live there. And here's some typical pygmy rattlesnake habitat. Freshwater marsh with groups of slightly higher ground covered with palm trees and live oaks. Really a beautiful place and a wonderful place to do field work. And it's only 5 miles from where I work at Stetson, and I actually live a mile from where this photograph was taken. So I spend a huge amount of time out here with the snakes. And I'm going to talk about a whole series of different kinds of snake behaviors, like birthing, and actually show interesting maternal behaviors. I'm going to show you foraging behaviors. I'm actually not going to spend too much time on defensive behaviors and thermoregulation, and spend a little more time on mating behaviors, plus some odds and ends, various things. I just kind of like to document what snakes are doing, and I'll use videotape to do a lot of that. And to kind of organize it, I'm going to think about a snake's life, starting when you've got a pregnant female. And if you look at this female pygmy rattlesnake, you can see this huge bulge. She's not going to lay eggs. She's going to give live birth. And this actually is one we found giving birth. It's popping one out right now. The snakes are in a thin membrane, and the pit vipers, like garter snakes and our water snakes, are some of the snakes that give live birth. The eggshell is reduced to a very thin membrane, and that young snake will pop out of there and take its first breath minutes after birth occurs. And then in most snakes, what happens Here we've got a female in some down debris. You can see resurrection fern and stuff. And if you look closely, you hopefully can see right under her chin right now, 3 or 4 little neonates. And she's got another one halfway down her body length. And so these are her babies. She gave birth in that debris pile, and she'll hang out with those snakes. These snakes are really good at hanging with their young. And that's unusual. If you look at something like a garter snake, as soon as they give birth, all the young snakes disperse, everybody moves apart. But in the rattlesnakes and the copperheads, we have this maternal attendance of young. And here's another litter. Mom's up on the palm frond. It takes a while to get used to seeing these guys. And she goes over every once in a while and checks the snakes out, but mostly they hang out, and they'll do this for about a week. And some people thought it was, oh, these baby snakes aren't ready to actually disperse and forage, and the mother's exhausted. She may lose 50% of her body weight when she gives birth. But we did a whole series of experiments that show if you separate mom from the babies and have walls in between them, the mother will climb over the walls in a big tank and go hang out with her litter. And you can set up the same kind of experiment, only the walls go to the top and mom can't get over the walls, but there's slots in the walls that the babies will fit through, and all the babies go and hang with mom. These are groups of snakes that are held together through active behavior. The babies like to hang with mom, and mom likes hanging with her babies. And so here's an example of why we think this occurs. We've done a bunch of studies, and this is involving basically using a model. And this is you may have seen a coral snake model like this, but we actually make it smell like a coral snake by putting stuff on it. And here comes mom down the palm frond. She aggressively comes after the coral snake. Basically, here's the same video from a different angle. Mom's sticking her tongue out. Maybe she smells the coral snake smell we put on that model. You can see right by the mid body of the mother, there's a cluster of 2 young. There's another 2 young on the ground. We move the model over and approach the young again. Mom will react. And these mother snakes repeatedly do this. We also have looked at adult females without litters and pregnant females, and they ignore things like this. And so this is an example of maternal defense, and it's one of the things that makes pit vipers really cool. Some people get worried that, oh my goodness, that snake's going to get aggressive. That could be dangerous for humans. I've looked at over 100 of these aggregations, and actually probably closer to 300 because we do a lot of work on the reproductive behavior. And the mothers are not particularly aggressive towards humans, but you don't want to be a predator of young snakes and come close to mom. Here's another example. So often in Florida, the snakes are in denser places. You can see this thicket. And I knew that there was going to be a litter born here because the pregnant female was hanging out here. And so if we zoom in, I could tell where the litter was going to be because one of the young got up early in the morning and decided to go up and get some sun. And here's this little, about 8-inch long snake, not even as fat as a pencil really. Baby pygmy rattlesnakes are tiny. Sitting on a palm frond. Some of its siblings have already shed their skin for the first time, and I'll talk about that in a second. But mom is still here. She's watching over the young who are around her. And maybe you can see mom up there. And what I've done is introduced a black racer. And I've got this black racer velcroed, so I don't hurt the black racer, to a stick, and I can kind of present it. And when the female sees the black racer, it comes down and challenges it. Right now, you got a little more close up. You can see the pygmy rattlesnake coming down, and the black racer is kind of right beneath that pygmy rattlesnake's head. You may be able to see under the body of the pygmy rattlesnake, there's one of her young. And so she challenges the black racer. There you can see the baby right over mom's head. And she'll keep chasing this black racer till it retreats, which makes a lot of sense considering black racers love to eat little snakes, including little pygmy rattlesnakes. And so here I got the black racer. Usually I pull them back pretty quick, but as I was filming this, I left it there a little while. Fortunately, black racers are largely immune to pygmy rattlesnake venom because this mother decides she's had enough and goes after them, and the snake gets out of there, and there's quite a commotion. And so one of the things I like to tell people is, people sometimes wonder, what good is a rattlesnake? And, I can make lots of arguments. But one of the things we should point out is that they're actually a lot more interesting and a lot more social than you might think. And the fact that mother rattlesnakes take such good care of their young, I find kind of endearing. But this only lasts a week or so, at which point the young will shed their skin. That's what this guy's doing. This is a little baby, and it is sliding out of its old skin. And as soon as they do this, they disperse from the site where they were born and have to go out and find their own food and make their way in the world. They have to avoid predators, avoid getting eaten. And so we'll talk about some of those challenges they face. And it happens right after they shed their skin. And all these behaviors are found in water moccasins and copperheads and the bigger rattlesnakes. The young always hang out with the parents for about a week, and when they shed, they then go off and live on their own. And you can see this snake, when he finally pulls its tail out, will get its first rattle segment that we call the button. Every time a rattlesnake sheds, it gets a new segment on its rattle, and there it's pulling it out. So these young snakes, when they hit the world, need to successfully capture food, and pit vipers are sit-and-wait predators. So this, for example, is a close-up of a baby eastern diamondback rattlesnake. It's about 4 months old. It's taken actually in January. I got excited, so I'm shaking a little bit with the camera here. But if you back off, notice that foraging coil with the head on top and a loose S-shaped thing. Vipers are almost always really cryptic. Let me see if I'm smart enough to go back on that. But you can see when that's in the brush pile, it's pretty hard to see. And when these diamondbacks, even a 4 or 5 foot...
Mom quite likely gave birth up here somewhere.
You can hear me talking in the background. Even when we talk about a 4 or 5 foot long diamondback, that pattern is incredibly hard to see when they're hiding in palmetto or grass. And that makes it much more likely that a mouse or a quail or some other suitable prey item will make a mistake and come within striking distance, because they don't track down their prey. Well, I should say they don't chase their prey. They simply hold a position and wait for it. Here's the little guy moving off. And as you watch it move off, you can see that it's got basically, it's shed its skin a second time, which is kind of typical of a snake. Our rattlesnakes typically shed about 3 times in their first year and have, in their first summer, about 3 rattle segments. So here's another typical foraging coil, and pygmy rattlesnakes often will use logs as hunting places. And this guy has nestled down into a depression on the top of a log. And from the human standpoint, it's visible. It's fairly cryptic, but it's visible. But if you're a lizard, a typical prey item, walking down the length of that log, or a mouse running down the length of that log, it's going to be incredibly hard to see the animal when it's filling that depression. So I'll zoom back out again. You can get a better look at this. But pygmies really like logs. I always tell people at our study sites, never sit on a log without looking first. But they also really like coiling up just in the ground, in the litter. And so you'll see them like this, and that's the typical foraging coil. And you can see how the front part of that body is basically cocked and loaded and ready to strike. It's really important that these snakes pick the right place to hunt. And we've actually done some studies on that. One of our most interesting studies, we sprayed long strings laid out through the forest. We all around them, we sprayed frog scent, basically water in which frogs had been sitting. And then we had control strings, and the pygmy rattlesnakes would all come sit by the froggy lines. The smell of frog gets these guys to come in and sit. They love to eat leopard frogs. Now, when they're up in these foraging, they'll encounter prey. Here comes a skink. Now, if you look at that skink, as he walked by, he actually does some interesting things. He appears to see the snake, and he gives that snake a bunch of big wags with that bright blue tail, and then he stays safely out of distance as he continues on his way. I think, you know, that skink certainly saw the snake and moved on. And this has got to be frustrating for a little snake. That's a baby pygmy, could really use a good meal like that. But that one stayed safely out of reach. And in the videos, I basically set cameras up and leave the area so that the animals can act in a normal way. And so I'll end up with 4 or 5 hours of video, and the snakes will remain motionless typically, waiting for prey to come by. So here's another prey encounter, that pit vipers also eat birds, occasionally pygmy rattlesnakes. And the pygmy rattlesnake is hard to see here. It's on a palm frond. Maybe you'll see my cursor dodging back and forth. Basically a stick down here, and in comes a swamp sparrow. And I've got a lot of edits in here. This swamp sparrow spent 5 minutes, and it knew right where the snake was. And it got right over the snake. It got to the right of the snake, to the left of the snake. At one point, it actually gets somewhat behind and under the snake, but it just moves around and looks at the snake. It's not mobbing behavior like sometimes birds do to owls and other predators. There's not a lot of other birds here, but I think what this bird is doing, this little swamp sparrow, is it's memorizing what a pygmy rattlesnake looks like. Actually, when I teach students to find snakes, I show them a snake, and then I have them walk away, come back, look at it, come from a different direction, look at it, and just kind of burn it in from every possible direction. And birds seem to do the same thing. And so this swamp sparrow spent 5 or 6 minutes not foraging, not doing anything, but checking out that pygmy rattlesnake here down below it actually on the ground, looking at it from every angle, probably burning it into its brain so it never makes the mistake of getting too close. So here's another snake bird encounter. I set the camera up. The snake is in the leaf litter down here. You might be able to see it with my cursor now. And here comes the male yellowthroat. And the male yellowthroat does just what the swamp sparrow does. It starts moving around and checking out that snake from every conceivable angle where it can safely perch. And it also spent minutes just checking it from above, lower levels, right, left. There aren't other birds here. I don't hear a lot of other birds calling. Just that single male yellowthroat, but he's moving all over, checking out that snake from a dozen different angles. Now, this is kind of interesting. This particular snake, well, I often see birds come by snakes, but this was unusual in that the yellowthroat spent so much time checking the snake out. And then after it left, I'll move it along, and it just keeps moving. It was pretty impressive how interested it was. After it left, the mourning dove comes by, and the mourning dove doesn't seem to know what's going on here. The snake is just frozen in position, and then the dove stops, and I think it has an inkling that this might not be a good situation. And I'm not sure why the snake is making a strike at it. One of my colleagues said, you know, I said, I can't figure out why the snake would do that. It's not like the dove's a predator, so you didn't really have to go with the best defense is a good offense. It was a really half-hearted strike. It wasn't trying to hit the dove. And my colleague said, yeah, I think it was just trying to scare the hell out of it. So there's a lot of interesting interactions that occur with these animals. But if you're going to catch prey, and here's a young water moccasin. Young water moccasins are colored a lot like copperheads. As they get older, their color will change. Catch prey. Sometimes you need a way to bring prey close to you within striking distance. And if you eat frogs and lizards, and perhaps birds, the way a cottonmouth will, then wiggling your bright yellow tail is a way to lure them to their death. And this actually happens in loads of pit viper species. There's some other vipers in the old world. One has a tail that looks just like a spider, and it eats birds and lures them in with this spider lure. But you can see he wiggles this around like it's a caterpillar, hoping to attract something that eats insects. And he's working it pretty good here. Ultimately, he'll pop it up onto this branch above him, just trying to bring something in close enough, and perhaps it knows there's something out there. Not long after it was doing all this luring behavior, it's hard to see, but over on this far right side, a banded water snake is coming into view. And this banded water snake started in and quite likely figured out this was not the place to be and left in a hurry once it figured out that a really dangerous predator was so close to it. Water moccasins love to eat water snakes. Pygmy rattlesnakes also do the caught alluring trick. And so here it is, and you can see it pops that tail out, and they lure a little differently. Again, it's a yellow tail. It's kind of interesting to think about. Is there some reason why yellow is the best color for a lure? The luring snakes, there's, for example, members of the cobra family in Australia that lure, and they often have yellow tails. I think yellow tails are particularly attractive to some of the prey, and they don't much look like the snake. You can see a little jumping spider in there too, perhaps. And so luring can help bring prey in closer, and you can see that jumping spider has now jumped on the snake. You see this all the time, and the snake just sits there. That snake, its key to capturing prey is remaining motionless. And we often do things where we will tie an anole with a string near something like this to look at its behavior, to look at that luring behavior, and they never go after a prey item that's 2 feet away. Because if you chase after an anole or a frog, you won't get it. You've got to have the prey come to you. So you might wonder what triggers caught alluring. Here's a water moccasin I put a video camera on, and I was just kind of interested to see what it would do. And I was surprised when, all of a sudden a skink showed up. Oop, let me get that. And that skink is further than it might look. It wasn't in striking distance. And the water moccasin's response here is to get that tail in motion. And it gets more and more exaggerated. Here it lifts it up, and it decides that's not getting the skink back here where I can strike it. It tries a little harder. It ultimately moves it so that it's now even further up in the air. And this skink, I think, knows what's going on. It'll sneak down the backside of this palm frond and run behind the snake. It basically knows that snake's striking distance, apparently, and is really good. Here comes the skink. Boom. And the snake hears it as it runs down the palm frond behind it and turns around. Maybe it doesn't hear it. Maybe it felt the vibrations. Snakes, when they're about to shed, get those bluish eyes. It's interesting that it knew that skink was around, even though its eyes were all cloudy. So I'm going to stop the share, and I'm actually going to pull up a different share just to make sure. Is this sound and everything okay for you guys?
Everything's working.
Good. And so I'm going to share part 2 of this. And we're going to talk a little more about foraging, because if you're going to get to be a big snake and reproduce, you got to get lots of food. And I need to, whoa. Now, typically speaking, what happens with these guys in foraging, whoop, I'm not quite there, is that they strike a prey and then release it, wait for it to die, and then scent track it. It's called strike-induced chemosensory searching. But this pygmy has picked a perfect location, and you may be able to see right under that blade of that vegetation, a green anole is coming up. And the snake patiently waits for it to get right up in front of it, and it slams into it, hits it, and then starts chomping on it. In this case, it doesn't release it, which is really kind of interesting. And there you can see it finishing the prey off. But usually pit vipers strike and release their prey. Now, here's a predatory strike that doesn't go as well. Now, it'll be in a blink of an eye in just a second here. Boom, a skink ran up that palm frond, immediately sensed this coiled up snake. You saw this guy caught a lure before, and reversed its direction. And what I'm going to show you now is I'm going to go frame by frame. Each frame is a 60th of a second apart. And so 6 frames is a 1/10 of a second. And basically everything happens in less than a 1/10 of a second. You'll see in the first couple frames, I'll kind of count them, the skink will come up. So we're going to go frame by frame here. Right here. There's 1 frame, 2 frames, 3 frames, 4 frames. At 5 frames, you could see that thing launch its strike, the head gets blurry, and by 7 frames, it's over. The skink has actually totally changed its direction, accelerated down, and the snake misses it. These snakes are incredibly quick. If you watch them in real time, sometimes you almost really can't even see the strike. They're blazingly fast. And they tend to let go of prey incredibly quickly once they strike them, so the prey can't retaliate. But that was a miss, unlike that guy. Now, water moccasins do a bunch of different things. And so this one is down in a drying mud hole. And this is the easiest place to find water moccasins in Florida. When the dry season hits and the mud holes dry up, you end up getting water moccasins coming in. When the water's shallow, you'll see lots of banded water snakes, but later on the moccasins come in. And this guy's eating a brown haplo, one of these weird exotic species that has been introduced into Florida. It's actually kind of interesting because in pulling this thing out of the mud and eating it, he ends up with a big bunch of cypress mulch in his mouth. This isn't a garden, this is out in the swamps in Florida, but a strip of cypress got caught in his mouth. And it's interesting, sometimes they'll actually swallow debris like this with the prey. But this guy probably has had this problem before, and look at how he approaches dealing with it. He realizes that he doesn't want to eat all that bark. He finishes kind of swallowing the prey, and then he moves his head up, and he basically will scrape that against a branch until he gets it out of his mouth. And he really gets it hooked here, slides it against his body, and frees it up. It's really interesting. This snake, as soon as he ate that, went back down, decided to eat a couple of dead native catfish. Look at the way it uses the fangs in a kind of rotary motion to help pull that prey in. And water moccasins are basically acting like vultures here. They're scavengers. And probably the bulk of this diet of these animals are actually not things they catch live, but things they catch stranded on the mud that have died or are about to die. And after you eat a bunch of these things, you get a little thirsty, so it's going to eat another one. There's a little head-on swallowing action. And then it takes a drink of fish-infused pond water. In another 2 weeks, this pond will be totally dried up. Now in foraging, sometimes we see social interactions. Snakes are far more abundant than you would ever think by walking around. When I put these video cameras up in a spot and leave, I'm always surprised at how many snakes show up, particularly in these aquatic environments. And so here's this snake eating, but look what happens. He's got a little water moccasin is coming over and is just curious. What do you got there? He wants to know what it's eating, I think. And so it comes over to this much larger adult, seems like a dangerous activity, but it comes over and look at all that tongue flicking. It's smelling right now. It's getting an idea of what that bigger snake is eating. And I routinely see this when two snakes are hanging out in the same area. The second snake in will often come right up to the first snake in and smell its mouth. I think they're actually getting information about what's good to eat here. Here's a pygmy rattlesnake actually doing some prey ingestion. I basically saw this pygmy moving around, doing lots of tongue flicking. It was searching for something and I thought it might be prey, and then I saw a dead frog. So I set two cameras up on the dead frog and got out of the way so the snake could do its thing. And right now it's smelling the air, picking up molecules, smelling the ground, and that's brought it to the frog. The first thing they do when they find the prey is they start smelling different parts of the body. And this is basically how they figure out where to start swallowing from. Most prey items, it's a far better idea to start swallowing at the head. It's really interesting. In pit vipers, we know that their venom has one chemical which has a very distinctive odor that they use to track prey once they strike and release it. This frog was almost certainly struck earlier by the snake, released, and then it tracked down. And then you can see this typical jaw motion. Snakes have incredible dexterity with their jaws. It's not just that the back of their jaw is loosely attached to the skull. The front of the jaw, your mandible, your lower jaw, basically is all in one piece. It's fused in the front. These guys don't have a mandible that's fused in the front. It can move the right side and the left side independently. Furthermore, where the teeth are in the upper jaws, on your head, they're attached to your cranium. These guys, they're not, and they can actually, it looks like they're moving a lip, but they're actually moving that entire bone and all the teeth, and they can move it independently forward. And so he swallows it down. That was not a particularly large prey item. These snakes, pit vipers, will eat things. There's a big yawn. That way, 50%, even 80% of their body weight. It's really impressive. Here's another snake. One of the reasons why they can swallow such big things is they don't have a sternum, right? Their ribs don't attach in their middle, so their ribs can just swing really widely. Furthermore, in between those scales, they've got a bunch of extra skin. You don't normally see it, but you can see those pale whitish lines on that pygmy rattlesnake, and that's the distended skin. Once they eat, they've got to digest stuff. Here we're zooming in on a snake that's gotten probably a big leopard frog. Look how distended its skin is. And at this time, when they've got a big prey item, they'll just find a great place to hang out where they've got some sun and some shade. If you look at where the snake is, you've got sun, shade, a palm frond to hide under. That snake can just move a couple of inches in any direction and either get a little cooler, a little warmer, and thereby digest that meal in a couple days. We also have a bunch of snakes at this study site that bask because they've got a disease. And this is one of these basking snakes, and you can see it's got some lesions on its body, these discolored scales. As he bends around here, you'll see it more right in this part of the body. This is a snake that has snake fungal disease, which is a really nasty disease for snakes that we've been studying. And when they get snake's fungal disease, they spend huge amounts of time not foraging, but feeding, and they often don't fare very well. Now, if you eat, you're going to end up pooping. And so here's snake defecation, because a lot of people, shockingly, have not seen a snake relieve itself. And so this is a little water moccasin. He comes in and he checks out a pond. He keeps moving around here. He'll check it out. Oh, now he's in the background, and we've got a boat-tailed grackle who's come in. The boat-tailed grackle is smart enough not to get too close to the moccasin. The moccasin actually has got a mouthful here. It's found a little catfish or a tadpole to eat. But ultimately, this snake spent a fair amount of time in here, looking around, checking the place out, picking up a prey item or two. And here comes the most exciting moment, when it actually, if you look down right here where its body is underwater, you'll see a yellow cloud appear. And that's the uric acid from its, they have, basically it looks like bird poop with a lot of white or yellowish crap and dark crap. And then they pick the tail up so they don't drag the tail through their own excrement. And so he'll slide away, keep that tail up. The first time I saw it, I thought it was caudal luring while moving. And then I realized, oh no, that snake just had to relieve itself. One of the things I like to do is just show people what are really kind of mundane behavior, drinking behavior. So it's a rainy day in Florida. I focus the camera on a couple snakes, very little pygmy. And this behavior is something all pit vipers do, but almost no other snake does. When it starts raining quite hard, it'll drink off its body. So it's head down. I zoomed in some, and starts drinking off its body, and the scales have a particular waxy chemical composition, so the water beads up, and it really helps, for example, snakes that live in desert regions to get lots of water. Here's another snake doing the same thing. This is kind of looking from behind. But pit vipers, whether you're in the Arizona desert after a sudden thunderstorm or in Florida, use the same drinking behavior. If you get meals and drink, just saw that big yawn, it comes time to shed your skin. And when you got to shed your skin, you got to get that new skin that's underneath free from the old skin, and a lot of chin rubbing and nose rubbing takes place. You can see the snake is using its own body and a branch to rub on, and it's going to keep pushing on stuff until it rips the old skin open and it peels back from the body. And so there you can see a big snout push. It's still trying to get that skin loose. And ultimately, it keeps pushing and pushing, and it gets the skin peeling off from the head, and you can see the clear capsules. You get lots of yawns when snakes are doing that. They're stretching the skin out. It keeps pushing. And ultimately, this particular snake, whoop, will move through the vegetation and get that skin caught up on some sticks and twigs, and then it can just start pulling through. And I actually just kind of really enjoy watching snakes shed their skin. It's something I'd like to be able to do, to get a totally fresh, new, shiny coat, right? And you can see it's slowly moving along, pulling out of the old new skin. The old skin is being left behind. Here, we'll get another close-up of this in a second. I just think it's really impressive seeing it peel off. And you can see all that skin between the scales, right? That helps the snake expand its body so much when it's got a big meal. And it just kind of walks right out of its skin and then will move along looking much fresher and cleaner with its brand new skin. And also have one more additional segment on its rattle. So people often ask a lot about defensive behaviors. They do interesting things. They're really hard to see. That's the first line of defense. The big rattlesnakes will do hisses before you see them to kind of warn you away. It's hard to localize where that hiss is coming from. If a predator really messes with them, they may flee, they may hide their head, they may rattle. And that's not just rattlesnakes. The copperheads and water moccasins will shake their tails too. They may musk. And people think, well, of course they'll strike. And actually, water moccasins rarely strike, even when gently stepped on. And Whit Gibbons and his colleagues at Savannah River showed this. We've done the same things with pygmy rattlesnakes. We actually bonked a couple on the head, well, a bunch, actually over 1,000. And even when kind of hit in the face with a gloved finger, only about 8% of them struck. They would usually hide their head or flee. These snakes are not particularly aggressive, and you usually have to really molest them to get a nasty defensive response. And these defensive responses are important because they have natural predators. I was walking out to my study site one day and I saw this hawk take off from the ground, and I figured it probably had a prey item. And sure enough, it had a pretty big water moccasin. It's a young red-shouldered hawk, and you can see it ripping away at it. And hawks, particularly red-tailed hawks, but also red-shouldered hawks, can kill pit vipers. Possums have some immunity to pit viper venom and eat them. Bobcats are stunningly fast and can actually kill pretty large rattlesnakes and water moccasins. And so there's a host of predators these animals have to deal with. And that hawk is getting quite a nice meal out of this water moccasin. But I won't dwell too much on the defensive responses because I think so many of the other behaviors are more interesting, including mating behaviors. So all the pit vipers around here typically mate in fall, but some of them also have spring mating seasons. And the the females start to shed if they're adults, and that makes them attractive to males. The males move all over looking for females. This is often when the breeding season is when snakes show up in people's yards because they're moving around, and only some of the females reproduce each year. And so basically, here's courtship behavior, and it looks the same in each of the pit viper species. It's what we call a highly conserved behavior because it doesn't change much in evolution. And so the male kind of slides his body along the female, and he'll do lots of tongue flicks and chin presses in many cases. Right now, he also has got his tail wound around the female's tail. And what he's trying to do is get her to open up her cloaca, which is a reproductive opening. It's also the opening for the digestive tract and the urinary system. But he can't copulate with her unless she's willing. And females are often not very willing in snakes. And so males will spend days sitting on top of a female, chin pressing for hours and getting nowhere. But one thing that really seems to get females more receptive is when a male gets in a fight, which hopefully this does not extend to humans, but in pit vipers, all the species we study, we see male-male combat. And so males will compete for access to females, and females find that behavior attractive. And so this is what male-male combat looks like. I came upon these two pygmies in the field. They're not mating. These are two males, and there's a female coiled up about 1.5 meters away in a grass clump. These snakes rise up and try to push down the other snake. They don't strike each other. They don't use their most lethal weapons. This is ritualized combat behavior, and this is often the case in animal behavior, right? If you look at deer fighting with their antlers, they don't try to rip each other's eyes out and guts out typically. It's an intense battle, but they don't always use their most lethal weapons. And so these guys mostly just try to push the other one down until one achieves dominance, and then the loser slinks off, and the winner immediately goes back to the female, and she senses, probably through her chemical cues, that he has encountered and defeated another male, and that often makes her receptive. People who have done lots of lab studies of reproductive behaviors in southern copperheads found that it was almost essential, if you wanted to get your copperheads to copulate, is you had to get them through a male-male combat situation. And the females didn't want to mate with the losers. If you put them in with a loser, they only wanted to mate with the snake that won it. I find this particular male-male combat kind of mesmerizing, right? Some people think that the caudatus, the medical symbol, is basically a stylized version of this. So I'm going to start wrapping things up here. And I want to show you one last chunk of video. And it's going to have some male-male combat in it that I just kind of stuck on the front. But what this video does is it tells us a lot about pit vipers and snakes in general in the southeastern United States. And it's going to make a couple of points I want to make. One thing I find is that snakes are incredibly abundant. In my main Pygmy rattlesnake study site, I've got on a neighborhood in many years of 20 rattlesnakes per acre. You would never know that walking around. It's only through careful mark recapture studies that you figure out that there's this many snakes there. And that's true in many cases. And when I put video cameras out and no one's around, the snakes come out and it's stunning how abundant they are. They're really important in southeastern food chains. They eat lots of stuff and end up being eaten themselves by lots of stuff. So there's a little male-male combat here. But the reason I put the camera out is when I walked up to this pond that these snakes are right next to, I'd been filming the pond and I saw this little water moccasin right up against the backside of a big pig frog. It's like a bullfrog, and this frog has been struck in the hind limb, and you can see it can't move one leg, and in fact that leg has turned black. And as I was setting up my camera, the little snake slid away. I set the camera up, left, and while I left, another snake shows up. This is not the little snake who I think struck that frog and then released it. And so a bigger snake shows up, and then lo and behold, a second big snake shows up. So now we know we've got at least 3 water moccasins, all within a few meters of each other. The little guy who was originally trying to eat that frog, and these 2 bigger snakes. And the bigger snakes both seem interested in the frog, and they decide to get in a fight over it. And you can see that frog is right underneath them, right? The horrible situation for the frog. He's dying because of the venomous bite he's already received, and now he's got 2 big snakes fighting over who gets to eat him. And so you can see a prolonged period of combat here. One snake is bigger than the other. The other one, the smaller one, is actually more food motivated. And so this goes on for a fair while. At a couple points, the smaller one tries to break off the combat and grab the frog, but the bigger one keeps engaging it and trying to get it to basically, I think, submit and move off. And so we've got the little snake is in danger of losing his frog meal. 2 bigger cottonmouths fighting over it. And you know, it's really interesting when I watched this video, because I actually had no idea all of this went down. When I got back to the study site an hour after this happened, I didn't see any snakes. And in fact, now the really big water moccasin makes an appearance. And it's distracting the other one. And look what the smaller of the 2 snakes does. He grabs the frog by the head, starts eating it, and now once he's got a good grip on it, he makes a run for it. And because I wasn't there, I lose what happens next. I assume the snake that grabbed it runs off with it, and the sad part is watching this video, the camera's just set up on this site. Ultimately, the little snake comes back up and looks for his frog, which would have been a tremendous meal for the snake. He could have swallowed it, and it would have probably been the best meal he ever had. And he gets nothing out of the deal. You can see him doing lots of tongue flicks looking for that. But in kind of summary, these snakes have just fascinating behaviors. And the more video I take of them, the more convinced I am that they have really interesting interactions with each other. They're very social in ways that surprise people. They tend to think snakes are completely asocial, but that's not true. They have all kinds of interactions. They interact with a lot of different species and are one really cool, wonderful part of the wildlife here in the southeastern United States. So that's what I had prepared to show you. I ran on for a good while there. When I start talking about snakes, that tends to happen, but I'd be happy to take any questions if we have some.
That video there is absolutely amazing, Terry.
Yeah, it just blows my mind that I set cameras up and leave, and it's like, oh my goodness, I can't believe that's happening.
And the catch with that, though, too, is that you know how to think like a snake somewhat, so that you are setting up in places where you would expect a snake to be. So
yeah, no, it is. It's not just random, and I spent decades in these sites, and I actually like that the little pond that was there is a tip-up mound, and I know just what water levels need to be when it'll start drying up and all the snakes will come there. But the snakes know it too, and they'll actually move, through the environment from good habitat to good habitat. And that's why they're so abundant. It's really cool.
When you mentioned about the live birth, approximately how many young are born at a time from a female?
That most pit vipers have pretty small litter size, that they have trouble getting enough food. If you have to have your food come to you, it can be hard to get enough meals. And that's why they often skip years. Most females don't reproduce every year. They tend to go every other year. And for pygmy rattlesnakes, they typically have about 4 offspring at a time. Now they can have 11 or 12, but lots of them have 3 and 4. And I think the average is just over 4, that those big litters are unusual. And litter size is not all that much bigger for things like copperheads, water moccasins, and the big rattlesnakes. It's higher, but they have bigger offspring and it's not that much higher.
Somebody else asked as far as striking distance. They asked about young snakes versus adult snakes. Any sense of how to describe striking distance?
It's farther than you would think. That you hear people say, oh, they can only strike half their body length, and I have been surprised that a really aggressive snake can, particularly if it's got part of its coil backed up against something, can get surprising distance. And so, I don't want to give a general rule, and Tony, I'm sure you've looked at a million striking pissed off snakes, but you should not feel safe unless you're more than a body length away from the snake. And, to be quite honest, you're pretty safe if you're not intentionally irritating the snake. That if you just leave these snakes alone, you literally can step right next to them and perhaps even somewhat on them without getting bitten in the vast majority of times. They're incredibly forgiving, and that includes water moccasins, the big diamondbacks, and pygmies. So we would have most people who step right next to a rattlesnake never know what happened. These snakes don't rattle at you unless they're molested. I've never, other than snakes that are like crossing a road when you find them, these rattlesnakes and pygmies will not rattle at you from a distance. Typically, they don't do it until they've been molested.
A question about yellowtails. The question is, are those juvenile snakes, or how long do adults have a yellowtail?
Yeah, so they're juvenile snakes, and usually when they're about 1 year of age, and that's true, I think, in copperheads and water moccasins as well as pygmy rattlesnakes. Its tail color changes, and it may stay a little yellowish on the underside, but the top of it becomes colored in the same way as the body. And we've done a bunch of, we basically take a frog or a lizard, tie a little string around it, and put it about 3 feet away from the snake so it induces that caught alluring behavior. And the little snakes love to caught allure when you give them an appropriate prey item. The big snakes stop doing it around 1 year old. Every once in a while they'll do it if it's been there for a while and nothing else has worked for them. But basically when that tail changes color, tends to be when they stop engaging in that luring behavior.
As far as somebody asked about pit vipers being active at night.
Yeah, you know, I showed you all this video from the daytime, right? And that's in some ways misleading, that for much of the year, they're probably at least as active at night, and probably, like pygmy rattlesnakes, are probably getting more food at night in the daytime, because that's when the frogs are moving around. The frogs are pretty sedentary during the daytime, and at night they're moving around more, and that's when they tend to get eaten. And so pit vipers, so long as temperatures are, you know, in the 60s and 70s, will be out there foraging. They don't have to be super hot, and they're foraging all night long. It's these snakes spend huge amount of time on the surface of the ground in those very cryptic coils, day and night, waiting for a prey item to get close enough to eat.
Inevitable question. Somebody asked about boots. What kind of boots do you recommend?
I don't recommend a particular kind of boots. That I wear regular hiking boots. In my study sites, I get pygmy rattlesnakes on low branches. Every place I put my foot, I look at before I put my foot there. And I want to find snakes. That's how you find these snakes. But B is I know how abundant these snakes are. And, you know, I've actually yelled at students who they'll be talking to me and looking at me while they're walking. And I'll say, stop looking at me. It's just crazy. Get your eyes on the ground where you're putting your feet. You just have to watch where you put your foot, and a good pair of boots will help you immensely. But I don't recommend a particular brand or anything like that.
What I saw in Costa Rica is they use just as black rubber boots.
I use those for years, and it's like I'd come back from my field site, and it's what all the fern cutters and growers wear in this part of the world. And I'd get mistaken for a fern grove guy all the time.
Yeah. Okay.
Biologists and people who work in the ferneries wear those boots, but they're actually super effective. I wouldn't want to test them against a really big rattlesnake, but you shouldn't be kicking a big rattlesnake anyway.
That's true. With our last question is, you mentioned the fungal disease.
Yes.
Just mention a couple things about the snake diseases that you're dealing with.
You know, and that's what most of my research is actually about these conservation threats for snakes. And right now there's two really important ones. One is snake fungal disease, which we've studied for literally decades. And we're figuring all kinds of things out about, like, if a snake gets it, does it always die, or can it recover? How does it affect the snake's metabolic rate? And so we do these very careful things where we measure CO2 output, and we do lots of study on that. But this fungal disease really saps the snake energy. It weakens their immune system because they have less energy. They end up spending lots of time basking, but not foraging. That jacks up their metabolic rate. They shed a lot, that costs energy. And basically, they often do what bats with what's called white nose syndrome, another fungal disease, do. What ultimately kills them is they run out of energy. That it basically just trying to fight this fungal infection saps their energy. And unfortunately, it's confounded by a lung parasite that was brought to Florida, probably with Burmese pythons, And when that python came here, it had these pentastome parasites. They're basically blood-sucking worms that live in snake lungs. And they use frogs and lizards, we now know, as an intermediate host. And these also have a horrible toll on our snakes, including black racers. At the study site, I do most of my work. Over a third of the black racers have some of these nasty parasites in their lungs. About 30% of the pygmy rattlesnakes have them. And the snakes that have these in them are doing really poorly. And you often see, what we call comorbidity, that they get the parasite, and then they also get snake fungal disease. And it's just way too much for them. And we've seen, and in other parts of the pygmy rattlesnakes range, they seem particularly susceptible to this parasite, I think because both lizards and frogs carry it, and pygmy rattlesnakes eat loads of lizards and frogs. These two things are of huge conservation interest, and really interest in snake fungal disease and understanding of it has really only been developing in the last 15 years, really the last decade. And this pentastome parasite, no one knew we had it until about 5 years ago. And now it's spreading up the Florida peninsula incredibly fast. I suspect it's made it way into southern Georgia now. It's moving at an incredible pace. And so we're studying that in great detail.
I'm going to ask one final question and turn it over to Tony for the closer. And that is, somebody asked, do Burmese pythons eat native snakes?
No, Burmese pythons probably are eaten almost entirely mammals and birds. And we know they're just decimating bird populations. It's interesting, the Burmese pythons probably harm our native snakes, not in a direct sense by stealing their prey or by eating them, but because they carry these parasites, and that's probably the biggest issue.
Yeah. Tony, any closing comments?
I realize I'm a little bit biased, but that is one of my absolute favorite trust talks of all time. I just want to say that.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed that talk.
Yeah, and so with that, Terry, we really appreciate you being with us. Thanks for everybody joining us. You'll have to pass the word on to those people who weren't here. I'm sure they'll love to see the recording. And we hope to have Terry up at Spring Island here in the next year or so. So
I'd love that.
And
we'll
talk soon. Take care. Good night, everybody.
Good night.